All right, gentlemen, this is relapse prevention group number 4. Today we're going to be talking about building resiliency into your recovery. So, one of the things that in my life I have always been wondering about was I noticed as a kid, um, I would notice adults that would go through traumatic situations such as a death of a loved one or a divorce or just some other type of bad news. And one person would grow stronger out of that. Another person would, just start getting into like negative behaviors, and so you would think if one grows stronger, then the other would respond opposite and would kind of grow weaker through that situation. That it really throws them for a loop, and it ends up just creating a lot of negative behaviors in their life. And so I've always wondered, why is it that some people respond to negative situations and they grow stronger, and other people grow weaker through that? And I can never figure it out, and wasn't really sure. I never really looked at a whole lot, but it was just something that was always in the back of my mind. And 3 years ago, I really believe that I found the answer out. Going through a very traumatic situation myself, and I started researching. And so, kind of what I've discovered is resiliency, right? Resiliency. Um, and so, this is really what we need in our lives, right? And so, if you're going to live in recovery, as we talked about in group 1, that commitment is no matter what, right? That no matter what, you're going to continue to live in recovery, no matter if you have good news, bad news, that you're not just going to live in recovery right here while you're having this mountaintop experience here in West Virginia. But you need to have the attitude that you're going to live in recovery one day at a time, all right, no matter what, no matter what. And so, really, in order to do that, we need resiliency, all right? And so, I did research on resiliency, and and this is what I came up with. Right, this is what I found out about resiliency and how we can build it into our lives, and that's the cool thing, right? We can build resiliency into our lives, right? So, and you have to think too that for all of the years that you were in your addiction, right, you trained your body and your mind that whenever you go through a negative situation, whenever you go through tough times, go through an argument, that hey, now is the time to use, right? And so now you got to train your mind and your body that hey, I can do something differently. I don't have to use, I don't have to take a drink right now. And so this is what I called building resiliency into your recovery, because these principles are going to help you to stay in recovery no matter what's going on in your life. All right. So the first step is the first quality that you need is the resilient attitude. The resilient attitude. And so you have what it takes, right? You have to believe that you have what it takes to live in recovery one day at a time, right? Without using drugs and alcohol, right? And so that you have what it takes, that you can achieve long term recovery one day at a time, right? And so you have to believe it. If you don't believe it, then you need to start with that you have what it takes, that you have the skills to help you along the way, right? And so at first glance, it seems like that this principle opposes powerlessness, right? And so when I really started thinking about it, I was like, I wondered that. And so I determined that I don't believe that it does, because what powerless says is that the moment you take a drink, right, you become powerless to that substance. All right. So right now, no one should be using illegal drugs and alcohol here on the mountain, correct? Come on, guys, that was a little quiet. I get a little worried when y'all get quiet about that. All right, that was better. When you leave here and you go back to DC, you are still going to be not using drugs and alcohol. So the resilient attitude says you have what it takes to not take that first drink. Powerlessness says the moment you take that first drink, you're off to the races, right? So I believe they work hand in hand together. The resilient attitude says you have what it takes to not take that first drink or that first hit, right? Powerlessness says the moment you do, you become powerless to that substance, all right? So right now, no one is forcing you to drink. No one is, and even if someone were to come up and said, you need to take a drink, right? Or you need to smoke this, right? You still have a choice. You have a choice whether you want to take that drink, take that smoke, take that bump, do whatever, right? That is your choice. The moment you make that choice, then you're off to the races. And so I really believe that the resilient attitude works hand in hand with it, right? And so here's the cool thing. Every single one of you in this room has some level of resiliency already. You do. If you didn't have some level of resiliency, you would not be here today. You would have given up a long time ago, and you would not be with us today. All right. So because you're here, that proves that you have some level of resiliency already. And so now what you need to do is take that resiliency and continue to build it and work it in your life and to grow in it and get stronger with it, right? And so, and that's the cool thing about it, right? You can grow in it. And so it's about having the attitude of having what it takes to live in long-term recovery one day at a time, all right? So the second is to focus on your strengths. All right. So now this, when I learned this principle, it totally blew my mind away because it was pretty much opposite of everything that I have always learned and taught about, personal strengths and weaknesses and personal growth. And, because everybody teaches that you should take your weakness, right? Identify your weaknesses and then make them stronger so that they're no longer your weaknesses anymore. And so that's the way I've lived my whole life until 3 years ago. And so when I read this, it just blew my mind away. I'm like, why wouldn't you focus on your weaknesses and make them stronger? And so here's the reason why, right? Like I said, you all have some level of resiliency already. You are here today, right? And so think about a difficult time that you've had in your life, right? And what enabled you to make it through that difficult time period, all right? And so our strengths are what got us to this point, right? That's what gets us through difficult situations. And so continue to use what works for you. Continue to use what works for you. And so in order to make it through difficult storms in the future, look at what works for you and continue to use it. Why would you use something that doesn't work for you? There's something that's not effective for you. And so when I learned that, I'm like, wow, that there's a lot of truth to that. So many times we focus on our weaknesses and we beat ourselves up, right? Because we may not stack up to others. We focus on our weaknesses. We focus on the areas that we're not very good at. And then we start comparing ourselves to others, right? However, true resilient individuals focus on their strengths because their strengths are what works for them, right? And so here's what I want you to do. Make a list of a difficult time, right? Think about a difficult time or a problem that you've experienced in your life and what was within you or outside of you that helped you to overcome this problem. Was it a group of friends? Was it belonging to a church? Was it a coping skill that you used, right? Think about all those things that it could be either something inside of you or something outside of you that helped you to overcome this problem. And your answers to this will lead you to your strengths, right? And then ask yourself how you can use these strengths to stay clean and sober, right? And so if you have a strong network of close friends and they encourage you during difficult times, right? That enabled you to make it through a difficult time. That would be a strength of yours, is having a close knit network of friends, of support system, right? And so, how can you use this to stay clean and sober? Well, continue to tap into that network, and you help, let them guide you and help you through difficult times when you get to that point where you want to start using again. All right. So that's number two. Number three is a pro recovery support system, right? Pro recovery support system. I mean, this is strictly what AANA teaches you, right? That you need to have a network, right? So you need a pro recovery support system. And so one of the things that I want to identify is just because someone doesn't use drugs and alcohol doesn't mean that they are beneficial for your recovery. All right. So here's an example. We had a client 3-4 years ago. He was living on his sister's couch. All right. She was married, had 1 or 2 kids, and she did not use drugs and alcohol, had no experience with it. All right. And she said, "You can sleep on my couch as long as you don't drink or use in my house." One day, she comes home, he's drunk on the couch. And she says, "You got to leave. You can't do this in my house, in front of my family, around my kids." So he was left homeless, didn't know what to do. He turned to us. He ends up in West Virginia. He comes in early November. All right, so his 30 days goes by. He gets his phone call. Who do you think he's going to call? He called his sister. So this is the beginning of November, or beginning of December. And she says, "Hey, you know what? You've been there for 30 days now. You're good to go. You can come home now and live with me. And you can be home before Christmas and we can all celebrate together." And so she loved him very much. There was no doubt of that. Um, but the issue was she almost jackpotted his recovery because she did not understand the basic principles of recovery, right? So she didn't use drugs or alcohol. She had no experience with it, was totally clueless, right? So, and what she was doing, she thought she was doing for the best of him, but it was really almost jackpotting his recovery, and it really messed with him. And so he really debated of leaving the program and going back home. And so he finally decided, made the right decision. He stayed, and he ended up graduating, right? And so the cool thing was is that his sister and nephews were his biggest cheerleader during the graduation. You know, they had big signs up. They were yelling and clapping and screaming. It was an awesome sight to see. And so she had good intentions, but what she was doing was working against his recovery. And so just because people don't use drugs and alcohol doesn't mean that they're going to be good for your recovery, right? They need to have an understanding of recovery, because they could just naively jackpot you with some bad advice because they just don't understand those principles. And so if you have a family member or a friend that you want to include in your network that doesn't use drugs and alcohol, you want to get them plugged into Al-Anon. All right, that is a support group, 12-step type group that supports AANA, and it will really teach them how they can support you as a family member, right? And it'll give them the education that they need about recovery, right? And not being your enabler or being codependent, trying to fix you and different things like that. And so you've got to have a pro recovery support system, right? You need to surround yourself with winners and people or organizations that believe the best in you and who will provide support and encouragement in your recovery, right? Time and time again, right? A component of relapse is when people start to hang out with old using friends.